The Orlando International Airport was busy, as it always was. People rushed from one side of the terminal to the other, pulling suitcases, sipping coffee, and talking on their phones. Announcements about delayed flights played over the loudspeakers, blending with the sound of footsteps and rolling luggage. In the middle of all this chaos stood a man who looked calm, even peaceful. Shaquille O'Neal, or Shaq as most people knew him, was in the first-class line, waiting to check in for his flight. At 7 feet tall, he towered over everyone else in the line. But he didn't act like a giant. He stood quietly, wearing a simple gray hoodie, loose jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. Over one shoulder, he carried a gym bag. It wasn't fancy, but it was practical, and it looked like it had been with him on many trips. Even though Shaq was one of the most famous basketball players of all time, he didn't draw much attention. He wasn't wearing flashy jewelry or carrying expensive luggage. He didn't act like someone who wanted to be noticed. If you didn't recognize him, you might think he was just a regular guy. That's exactly how Shaq liked it. Behind Shaq in the line was another man named Preston Walsh. Preston was the opposite of Shaq in almost every way. He was a financial advisor who prided himself on looking successful. He wore a navy blue suit that fit him perfectly, shiny leather shoes, and a gold watch that glinted under the airport lights. His cologne smelled expensive, and he carried a sleek black briefcase that he held tightly, like it was a symbol of his status. Preston wasn't the kind of person who liked waiting in line, and his impatience showed. He tapped his fingers against the handle of his briefcase and checked his watch every few minutes. When his eyes landed on Shaq, a frown crept across his face. He looked Shaq up and down, taking in the casual clothes and simple bag. Preston thought he knew exactly what kind of person Shaq was, and it bothered him. "First class, huh?" Preston said, his voice loud enough to carry over the noise of the airport. His tone was light, but there was an edge to it. "Didn't expect to see someone so relaxed in this line." Shaq turned his head slowly to look at Preston. His face didn't change, and his calm expression stayed the same. "Yep," Shaq said simply. Preston raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting more of a reaction. "Guess the airlines are letting just about anyone fly up here these days," he added, chuckling to himself. Shaq didn't reply. He just stood there, his tall frame steady, as the line moved forward. His silence made Preston feel uneasy, though he didn't show it. Preston was used to being the loudest voice in the room, but Shaq's quiet confidence threw him off balance. When it was finally their turn to board the plane, Shaq stepped forward with his ticket. He handed it to the gate agent with a polite nod, then walked down the jet bridge, his long strides unhurried. Preston followed closely behind, still eyeing Shaq with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. He couldn't understand why someone who looked so ordinary was flying in first class. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was a picture of luxury. The seats were wide and plush, with enough legroom for even someone as tall as Shaq. Each passenger had a blanket, a pillow, and a screen for watching movies. Soft music played in the background, and the air smelled faintly of leather and fresh coffee. Preston found his seat and let out a low groan of frustration. Shaq was sitting in the seat next to his. "Of all the people," Preston muttered under his breath as he shoved his briefcase into the overhead bin. He slid into his seat stiffly, avoiding eye contact with Shaq. Shaq, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease. He adjusted his gym bag under the seat in front of him and leaned back, taking in the surroundings. His knees were a little cramped even in the spacious seat, but he didn't complain. "You've got to be kidding me," Preston said, shaking his head. "This is going to be a long flight." Shaq glanced at him and smiled slightly. "Could be worse," he said. "At least we're not stuck in the middle seat back there." He gestured toward the crowded economy section. Preston didn't laugh. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started scrolling through emails. He wasn't used to sharing space with someone he didn't respect, and he couldn't help but feel that Shaq didn't belong here. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Preston decided to break the silence. He didn't want to spend the next few hours sitting next to someone without at least trying to figure them out. "So," Preston began, his voice casual but laced. With curiosity, "What do you do?" Shaq turned his head to look at Preston, his calm gaze steady. "A little bit of everything," Shaq said. "Played some basketball, did some business, helped some kids along the way." Preston raised an eyebrow. "Basketball, huh? That explains it. You probably got lucky and landed some endorsements. Must be nice to have things handed to you." Shaq didn't react the way Preston expected. He didn't get defensive or angry. Instead, he smiled slightly. "Luck's part of it," he said. "But luck doesn't last unless you work hard to keep it." Preston smirked, leaning back in his seat. "Hard work? That's what people say when they don't want to admit they've had it easy." Shaq tilted his head, studying Preston. For a moment. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you do?" Preston puffed up his chest a little. "I'm a financial advisor. I help people grow their wealth. Takes a lot of skill and discipline. Not exactly something you see in basketball players." Shaq nodded slowly, as if he was considering Preston's words. "Sounds like an important job," he said. "Must take a lot of trust from your clients." Preston blinked, caught off guard by the comment. "Well, yeah," he said, stumbling slightly. "You've got to prove yourself, you know? Show people you're the best." Shaq leaned back in his seat, his large hands resting on the armrests. "Sometimes the best way to prove yourself is by staying humble," he said. "Let your actions speak louder than your words." Preston didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to say. Shaq's calm tone made it hard to argue with him, but Preston wasn't ready to back down. He was determined to show that he was the one in control of this conversation. The flight attendant came by with drinks, and Preston ordered champagne, with a confident smile. When it was Shaq's turn, he asked for water. "Just water?" Preston said, raising an eyebrow. "You're in first class. You could have whatever you want." Shaq chuckled softly. "Water's all I need," he said. "Sometimes simple is better." Preston laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. "Simple? That's what people say when they don't know how to enjoy the finer things in life." Shaq took a sip of his water, unfazed. "Or maybe it's what people say when they know what really matters." The conversation hung in the air, heavy with unspoken tension. Preston turned away, pretending to focus on his laptop. But he couldn't stop thinking about Shaq's words. There was something about the way Shaq carried himself, quiet, confident, unshaken, that made Preston feel uncomfortable. As the plane climbed higher into the clouds, the differences between the two men became clearer. Preston was all about appearances, but Shaq seemed to care more about what was underneath. And though Preston didn't realize it yet, this flight was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Shaq leaned back in his seat, his calm demeanor steady as ever. He flipped through the pages of a book he'd pulled from his bag, its edges worn and dog-eared. Meanwhile, Preston sat stiffly beside him, typing furiously on his laptop, as if the sound of the keys would somehow drown out the thoughts swirling in his head. But Preston couldn't ignore the feeling that Shaq's simple responses had stirred something inside him. He kept sneaking glances at the giant man beside him. Shaq wasn't doing anything remarkable. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy. but his presence felt larger than life. It bothered Preston more than he wanted to admit. Finally, Preston couldn't hold it in any longer. He closed his laptop with a sharp snap and turned to Shaq. "You talk a lot about humility and all that," Preston began, his tone dripping with skepticism. "But in the real world, people respect power, not simplicity." Shaq closed his book, marking his place with a folded piece of paper. He turned his head slowly, his expression calm but thoughtful. "You think respect comes from power?" he asked. "Of course it does," Preston said quickly. "People need to know you're at the top, or they'll walk all over you. That's just how the world works." Shaq's lips curled into a small smile. "I don't know," he said. "In my experience, real respect doesn't have to shout. It's quiet, like the roots of a tree, strong enough to hold you up, even in the worst storms." Preston raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his seat. "That's a nice metaphor, but it's not how things are. You have to prove you belong, especially in places like this." He gestured to the first-class cabin, with its plush seats and polished finishes. "People judge you the second you walk in. If you don't show them you're successful, they'll treat you like you don't belong." Shaq chuckled softly, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Sounds exhausting," he said. "Worrying so much about what other people think?" Preston blinked, momentarily thrown off. "It's not about worrying," he said quickly. "It's about earning respect." "Maybe," Shaq said, nodding slightly. "But I think the respect that really matters comes from how you treat people, not how much you have." Preston's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone he assumed was beneath him. But before he could come up with a response, the flight attendant appeared with their meals. The flight attendant handed Preston his tray, a carefully plated dish of grilled salmon and roasted vegetables. "Here you go, sir," she said with a polite smile. Preston nodded curtly, barely acknowledging her. "Thanks," he muttered, already focused on cutting his salmon into perfect bites. When she turned to Shaq, her smile grew warmer. "Mr. O'Neill, here's your meal," she said, placing the tray in front of him. "Let me know if you need anything else." "Thank you," Shaq said, his deep voice kind and genuine. He looked up at her and added, "Appreciate you taking care of us." The flight attendant blushed slightly and nodded. "Of course," she said, before moving on to the next row. Preston noticed the exchange and frowned. "You're good at that, huh?" he said, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "Winning people over." Shaq shrugged, picking up his fork. "It's not about winning anyone over. It's just about being decent." "Decent?" Preston scoffed. "Decency doesn't get you ahead. People respect strength, not kindness." Shaq chewed his food thoughtfully before replying. "Strength and kindness aren't opposites. Real strength is knowing you don't need to put others down to lift yourself up." Preston rolled his eyes, but he didn't respond. He focused on his meal, though the taste didn't seem as satisfying as he'd hoped. Around them, a quiet tension filled the air. Passengers nearby were beginning to notice the exchange, stealing glances and whispering to each other. Later, as the meal trays were cleared and the lights dimmed, the conversation took a deeper turn. "You know," Preston said, his voice quieter now, "you keep talking like you've got it all figured out. Like you don't care what anyone thinks. But that's easy for you. You're Shaquille O'Neal. You've already made it." Shaq leaned back in his seat, his face thoughtful. "You think I've got it all figured out?" he asked. "You think just because I've got a name, life's easy?" Preston shrugged. "Well, yeah. You're famous, rich. Everyone knows who you are. What could you possibly worry about?" Shaq's expression softened, And for the first time, he looked a little sad. "You ever heard the saying, 'Heavy is the head that wears the crown'?" he asked. Preston frowned, unsure where Shaq was going with this. "Being in the spotlight doesn't make you invincible," Shaq continued. "It just makes your struggles harder to hide. People expect you to be perfect. They watch every move you make, waiting for you to mess up. And sometimes, the more you have, the lonelier it gets." Preston didn't know what to say. He had never thought about fame that way. To him, being famous seemed like the ultimate success. But as Shaq spoke, he realized there might be more to it than he had ever considered. "I don't say that to complain," Shaq added. "I've been blessed in a lot of ways, but it's taught me something important. None of the stuff people think matters. Money, fame, status. None of it means anything if you don't have people in your corner. People who care about you for who you are, not what you have." Preston's face tightened. He thought about his own life, the long hours at work, the endless networking, the constant pressure to be the best. He had money and success, sure, but how many people really cared about him? How many people truly knew him? The plane grew quieter as some passengers dozed off, but Preston couldn't sleep. Shaq's words echoed in his mind, making him question things he had never thought about before. All his life, Preston had believed that success meant proving you were better than everyone else. But sitting next to Shaq, he began to wonder if he had it all wrong. After a long stretch of silence, Preston finally spoke again. "You said something earlier," he began, his voice hesitant, "about respect, about treating people right. I guess I don't think about that stuff much." Shaq turned to him, his eyes warm and patient. "It's never too late to start," he said simply. Preston nodded slowly, his heart heavy with thoughts he couldn't put into words. For the first time in a long time, he felt small, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of small that reminded him he was still learning, still growing. By the time the plane began its descent, Preston felt like a different person than the man who had boarded a few hours earlier. He hadn't expected a simple flight to change him, but somehow it had. Shaq's quiet wisdom had cracked something open inside him, forcing him to see the world and himself in a new light. As they prepared to land, Preston turned to Shaq and held out his hand. "Thanks," he said, his voice steady, "for, putting up with me." Shaq grinned, his massive hand engulfing Preston's in a firm shake. "No problem," he said. As they disembarked, Preston watched Shaq walk away, his large frame disappearing into the crowd. For the first time in years, Preston didn't feel the need to prove himself. Instead, he felt something else: hope. And as he left the airport, he carried a simple truth with him. True success isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat the people around you. Preston walked through the terminal, his polished shoes clicking softly on the tiles. The noise of the airport felt distant, muffled by the thoughts swirling in his head. He carried his sleek briefcase in one hand, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a symbol of success. It was just a bag, nothing more. Shaq's words echoed in his mind. Real respect doesn't have to shout. It's quiet, like the roots of a tree. Preston glanced around at the sea of faces passing by. He had spent so much of his life looking at people and seeing only what they showed on the surface. But now, he couldn't help but wonder about their stories. Who were they behind the suits, the sneakers, the hurried footsteps? What struggles were they carrying that no one could see? For a moment, he stopped and looked down at his phone. A notification blinked on the screen. An email from a high-profile client, demanding immediate attention. Normally, Preston would have jumped to respond, but this time he slid the phone back into his pocket. It could wait. Outside the airport, the Florida sun was bright, casting long shadows across the pavement. As Preston stepped into the warm light, he felt a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't just the conversation with Shaq that had changed him, it was the realization that he didn't have to keep pretending. He didn't have to constantly prove his worth to others. Maybe it was okay to just be. A taxi pulled up to the curb and Preston climbed in, setting his briefcase gently on the seat beside him. "Where to?" the driver asked. Preston hesitated for a moment, then gave his address. As the car pulled away from the airport, he gazed out the window, watching the world blur past. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his next meeting, his next deal, or his next move up the ladder. Instead, he thought about what kind of person he wanted to be. Meanwhile, back in the terminal, Shaq stood near the baggage claim, surrounded by a small group of fans. Despite his towering frame and undeniable presence, he greeted each person with patience and kindness. He posed for photos, signed autographs, and listened intently to the stories people shared with him. "Thanks for taking the time," a young man said, after snapping a selfie with him. "You're a legend," Shaq smiled warmly. "Thanks, man. Just trying to do my best, like everyone else." As the crowd began to disperse, Shaq picked up his gym bag and slung it over his shoulder. He didn't rush. He had learned long ago that life wasn't about racing to the finish line, it was about appreciating the moments along the way. With steady steps, he made his way toward the exit, blending into the crowd as effortlessly as someone his size could. Back at home, Preston found himself pacing his living room. The walls were lined with framed certificates and awards, all carefully placed to showcase his achievements. But as he looked at them now, they didn't bring him the pride they once had. Instead, they felt hollow. He thought about Shaq, how he had carried himself with such quiet confidence, how he had turned every challenge Preston threw at him into a lesson. And most of all, how he had treated everyone, from the flight attendants to Preston himself, with kindness and respect. Taking a deep breath, Preston reached for his phone. He didn't open his email or check his messages. Instead, he pulled up the contact list and called his assistant. "Hey, Sarah," he said when she answered. "I just wanted to say thanks for all the work you do. I know I don't say it enough." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Oh," Sarah said, her voice soft with surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Walsh. That means a lot." Preston smiled. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something bigger. Maybe he couldn't change overnight, but he could start now. And as he ended the call, he felt lighter, like he was finally moving in the right direction. Somewhere in the world, Shaq was likely on another flight, heading to another city, ready to leave his mark on more lives. He didn't need to preach or demand attention. His actions spoke louder than words, and his message was clear. True success isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat the people around you. Life is full of lessons, some of which come when we least expect them. What happened to Preston after this encounter? Did he truly change, or did he slip back into old habits? Click on the screen to watch the next story and find out how one small moment can ripple into something much bigger. Watch the next video now.